It is 10 a.m. here in Copenhagen, and it's my pleasure to wish you all welcome to this webinar on the EU forced labor regulation. My colleague Sara and I will walk you through the requirements and what we know about this regulation today, also what's still open and being discussed. And I hope you'll find our insights useful. And of course, please do contribute with questions as we go along the way. But first and foremost, welcome. It's always such a pleasure when we host these webinars to see the participant list. There's over 200 of you signed up for this webinar today, and we couldn't be more pleased that you're choosing to spend this time with us. So welcome, everybody, and let's make this hour a useful conversation and hopefully also some useful insights for you. I wanted to make sure that you're all aware of how the Q&A functions work. So you should see at the bottom bar a Q&A section. Here's where you can write in your questions. We'll see them come in on a rolling basis, and then we'll tackle them either as we go along or in the dedicated Q&A section at the end. So please make sure to post questions as you might have them during the session. My name is Anina Kristinsson. I'm the CEO of Nordic Sustainability, and I'm joined here by Sara Salonoja, one of my colleagues. Sara is an associate manager in our policy and strategy team, and together we will be tackling what the forced labor regulation really entails and how companies should start preparing for it. First, a few words about us as a company. I know some of you are already familiar with us. As I'm checking the participant list, I see some familiar names. So welcome to everyone, both those who know us and who are new to us. We are a Copenhagen-based sustainability consultancy. We've been around for 9 years. We serve some of the largest global clients. Many of them are based in the northern part of Europe or in neighboring countries, but our work is global and so are our clients. We work across the whole field, both in terms of strategies, reporting and policy-focused work, but also deep thematic work, for example, within climate and nature. And of course, we aim to serve our clients in the ways that they currently need. And if it's climate transition plans, then of course that's what we help them with. Or if it's more reporting needs, then that's where we also go. We are sector agnostic in the sense that we work across multiple sectors, but of course there are some that have emerged as thematic areas for us, and in particular manufacturing, energy, pharma, and so on. You see some of these examples on the screen are typically areas that our clients are active within. Let's move on. So what are we going to tackle here today? First of all, we're going to do an intro to what is the EU forced labor regulation. How does it sit in the due diligence space where it also kind of belongs, although it's a market access regulation? How is it going to be enforced, and how should you as a company start preparing ahead of the 2027 enforcement timeline? As mentioned, it's going to be my colleague Sara who's going to walk us through some of the initial content here, and then towards the end I'm going to talk a little bit more about the preparation elements. I'm also going to be the moderator of this session and going to make sure to cover some of the questions that you're posting in the Q&A as we go along. But with this, over to you, Sara.
Thank you, Anina, and good morning to everyone. I'm going to start off by giving a bit of context for the regulation and then introduce what it entails before diving into more details about its enforcement and what the EU guidance tells us. So first, let's set out why the EU forced labor regulation exists before moving on to what it exactly requires. So why do we need this regulation? There are a few key points to make. First of all, forced labor is not a marginal problem. According to ILO, around 28 million people are in situations of forced labor worldwide, and most of it occurs in the private sector supply chains. Secondly, we see that certain groups of people are more impacted than others. the risk of ending up in forced labor is 3 times higher for migrant workers. It's also important to note that 5 sectors, so the services, manufacturing, construction, agriculture, and domestic work, account for 87% of all adult forced labor. These value chains are, of course, highly impacted, but forced labor does occur across all sectors. Then finally, we also see that the problem is not going away. In recent years, forced labor has in fact increased, and voluntary due diligence has not closed the gap, which is why the EU has moved from encouraging due diligence to banning products made with forced labor. Then here we see a few different cases of suspected or confirmed forced labor. It's easy to think about forced labor as something of a distant issue, not something that happens in the EU, but somewhere further away and deeper in the supply chain. But in reality, 15% of global cases occur in Europe and Central Asia, and these 3 examples have occurred in the EU in recent years. So first of all, we have a case from Italy in 2025 and 2026, where an investigation found severe exploitation of migrant workers at subcontractors used by 13 luxury fashion brands, including Dolce & Gabbana, Versace, and Prada. And the abuse sat in the supply chain, not at the brand itself here. Second, we have a case in Finland that was ongoing in the last 2 years. The former head of a berry company was convicted in one of the country's largest human trafficking cases. Berry pickers from Thailand were recruited under false promises and left in debt. And thirdly, we have Belgium, an example where prosecutors identify 55 victims of human trafficking on a construction site at the port of Antwerp on a project for a major chemical company. And I think it's good to note that we often see a similar pattern in these cases. So the buying company is European and the exploitation happens through labor intermediaries or subcontractors it does not control directly. And the risk enters here through a labor supply. The risk is concrete for companies in the EU. We do see that forced labor is not only an issue in distant sourcing countries, but it appears in construction, agriculture, and textile industry, to name a few. So really visibility into supply chains is becoming more and more important, and knowing your first tier suppliers is no longer enough, but you need to know who supplies the labor at which sites and through which intermediaries. Then if we look at the regulatory picture, forced labor rules are only one piece of it. So on the left here, we have the laws already in force, national due diligence acts in the UK, France, Norway, and Germany, as well as the US import ban. And then from 2026 onwards, we have an increase in EU regulation. So the deforestation regulation, batteries regulation, the empowering consumers directive targeting sustainability claims, and the due diligence directive all land within a few years. And the forced labor regulation applies from December 2027. And this is the one that we will focus on today. It's good to know that these are examples from Europe and the US, but there are many regulatory developments also in the Asia and Pacific region with similar regulation emerging. And important for today is that these regulations all share the same foundation, value chain traceability and supplier due diligence. So if you build a strong foundation once, you can meet several requirements at the same time. Then moving on to EU forced labor in more detail. So in a nutshell, here are 5 things that we want to highlight before we go deeper into the details of how the regulation is enforced. So first of all, we have the scope of the ban. So the EUFLR prohibits placing or making available on the EU market or exporting from the EU any product that's made with forced labor. It's a product level ban specifically and not a company level sanction. Secondly, the ban applies to all products regardless of origin, type, or sector, any goods made inside the EU, as well as imports, and any component or stage of production. There's also no sectoral carve-out or a minimum threshold. Then thirdly, there's the element of due diligence. The EUFLR does not itself impose a due diligence obligation, which is very important to note, but authorities will look at companies' due diligence when deciding whether or not to open an investigation and how to prioritize cases. So good practice here is the best defense. Fourth, how is forced labor defined? The regulation follows the ILO definition, so work exacted under menace of penalty and not offered voluntarily. The 11 ILO indicators of forced labor are used to identify cases, and these include, for example, intimidation, restriction of movement, withholding of wages, debt bondages, and so on. Then finally, the fifth point here is timing. So the regulation was adopted already in late 2024, but the enforcement begins on the 14th of December 2027. So that sounds still quite distant, but supply chain mapping and supplier engagement take time. So in practice, companies should start preparing as soon as possible. Then let's look at the scope of the regulation in a bit more detail. So overall, all products made with forced labor, regardless of origin, type, or sector, that are placed or made available on the EU market or exported from it are in scope. This also explicitly includes strategic military and defense products. It also includes any products that are made in whole or in part with forced labor. And here this means that forced labor has occurred at any stage, so the extraction, harvesting, production, or manufacturing, including working or processing at any stage of the supply chain, inside or outside the EU. So products are in scope irrespective of how small the share produced with forced labor is. And then what does product actually mean in this case? It's all manufactured goods, agricultural products, and extracted products such as minerals and other raw materials. Online and other distance sales are also in scope, where the offer is targeted at end users in the EU. So this includes both consumers and professional end users, so businesses, for example. And the guidelines list a few indicators for determining what is targeted at end users in the EU. So these include, for example, the ability to dispatch to EU areas, the use of member state language or currency, region-specific payment methods, and a member state domain name. The authorities can also act on such products before they are placed on the EU market. Then, when we look at which companies, all economic operators, or companies in simplified terms, are in scope. So producers, manufacturers, importers, exporters, retailers, and product suppliers. There is no size or turnover threshold for this regulation. And a final point to note is that the regulation applies to products placed or made available from the 14th of December 2027, even if the product or its components were produced or imported into the EU before that date. Then, what is not in scope? The regulation does not cover the withdrawal of products that have already been sold, so those that already reached the end user. It does cover products that are still being made available. So for example, if something is still in stock or on shelf, that would be covered. Finally, the provision of services is outside the scope. So this is the case even when linked to placing the product on the market. So the transport, warehousing, and logistics of a product is not included. Services and domestic work also performed with forced labor are outside of the scope. Because the regulation focuses only on products. And finally, just to note again that the ILO convention definition for forced labor applies. So there are three elements that should be noted: the work or service, lack of voluntary consent, and coercion. This includes forced labor in private sector, state-imposed forced labor, and forced child labor. These all three are covered. All right, next I will move on to looking at the enforcement of the regulation in a bit more detail. So, who actually leads the investigation? A suspected case of forced labor is always investigated by what's called a lead competent authority. That means the Commission, European Commission, where the suspected forced labor takes place outside of the EU. And then when it occurs within a member state's territory, it is the competent authority of that member state. It's also good to note that throughout the authorities, whether it's the member state's competent authority or the EU Commission, are bound by EU law, including proportionality. So the measures they take must be appropriate, necessary, and not impose an excessive burden. Then what about the enforcement of the decision to ban certain products? If the forced labor occurs outside the EU, It's crucial for the lead competent authority to work together with customs authorities to stop the banned product at EU borders. Within the EU, for example, market surveillance authorities have a very important role. And then finally to note, if a company does not comply with the ban, they are subject to fines, and these fines are set by the EU member states. Okay, let's look into the process for how an investigation is initiated. So the authorities cannot investigate everything, so there is a risk-based approach that's taken for prioritizing investigations. And the guidelines determine different factors to consider when identifying products or companies that the authorities should focus their investigations on. So on the product side, there's 3 criteria that we see here that are assessed together. First, we have the scale and severity. So more people affected means a higher risk. And severity depends on how many forced labor indicators appear, how hard the situation is to remedy, how long it has gone on, and whether the issue is systemic. So state-imposed forced labor is treated as high on both accounts. Secondly, the volume on the EU market. So the more of the product sold or exported, the higher the priority, because more businesses and consumers are, of course, exposed. Then thirdly, the share of the suspect part in the final product. This is about physically, functionally, or economically significant, how physically, functionally, or economically significant that component is. So the greater the share, the higher the priority. Then there's also a prioritization of the companies that are looked into. And again, 3 points here. So proximity and leverage. Authorities look at who sits closest to the production stage in question and who has the most power to stop the practice. So for forced labor outside the EU, that often means importers and distributors inside the EU are also covered. Then there's the size and resources of the company. So larger companies are expected to have more compliance capacity and expertise than SMEs, for example. And authorities also watch out for outsourcing to smaller firms to avoid scrutiny in these cases. The complexity of the supply chain is also a factor. So this does not decide who is targeted, but the authorities should consider that long multi-tier chains reduce traceability and usually require a deeper analysis. So the practical message here is that high volume products from high risk regions sold by large companies are likely to be looked at first. Then another key question is, of course, what information do the authorities assess to identify suspected cases of forced labor? So different sources are taken into account here. These include submissions to an EU submission point. That's something that will be established, and where anyone can report a violation. The EU forced labor risk database, another source that's going to be established. And then the information gathered from other authorities and stakeholders, such as civil society organizations, are also likely to be very important sources of information for the authorities. Then, if we look into what the full process, so from initial assessment to enforcement, will actually look like. So the purpose of the investigation is to establish whether the forced labor ban was violated and to determine which measures to impose. The authority needs to investigate 2 things at the same time. So whether forced labor was used per the ILO definition and forced labor indicators, and that the operator made the products available on the EU market or exported them. The focus is on the products here and not on the operator's entire business. So the investigations can target parts, components, intermediate or final products, product series or categories, or output from one named factory, and can be then broadened where the use appears more systemic. So if we look at the steps from the left here, so step 1 is the initial assessment, where a risk-based assessment takes place, which was introduced in the previous slide. So as mentioned, there are 3 criteria that are weighed together here, starting with the scale and severity of the suspected forced labor. The more people affected, more indicators present, the harder it is to remediate, longer running or systemic. These are all factors that push a case up the queue. Then the authorities work from information already available to them. So the forced labor risk databases, as mentioned, the submissions to the submission point, the single information submission point, and then sources, other authorities, the civil society and trade union reporting, and so on. Then we have step 2, which is the preliminary phase. And this is opened where the initial assessment indicates a likelihood of violation. So the aim is to gather enough information, decide whether there is a substantiated concern. And this means a reasonable indication based on objective, factual, and verifiable information that it is likely that the product was made with forced labor. The authority normally sends a request for information about the operators or the company's actions to prevent, mitigate, and bring forced labor risks to an end, and must take into account the operator's size and resources, so what it can reasonably access. And it's very important to note that this is a critical point at which to make the company's case. So the company should explain how they address forced labor risks in the relevant supply chain, or explain why the authority's concern does not touch their products. And if there is no substantiated concern or the reasons for it have been eliminated, no investigation is opened here. And just about the timing here as well, the authority has 30 working days from the receipt of the company's information to conclude whether they will start an investigation. Okay, if we then look at step 3, this is of course initiated once a substantiated concern is established. The company must be informed within 3 working days of the launch of the investigation and have the right to be heard at this stage. So further information requests carry a deadline of at least 30 or no more than 60 working days, with extensions available on justification. Field inspections are also possible at this stage, but reserved for very exceptional situations. And it's important to note again the deadline here, so the authority must either adopt a ban decision or close the investigation within a reasonable period, which in principle means no more than 9 months from the initiation. But the closure is not final, so a new investigation can follow if new information emerges. Then moving on to step 4, which is the decision. So the authority here bears the burden of proving both that forced labor was used and that the products were made available or exported from the EU market. And the guidelines expect a combination of evidence, including indirect and circumstantial material. So in practice, interviews, transcripts, written testimonies, grievance mechanism reports, and social audits. It's also important to note that non-cooperation from a company being investigated can also support a finding. And here, once the decision is made, the companies have 30 working days to comply for any non-perishable goods that are banned and 10 for perishable goods. Then finally, we have the enforcement. So inside the EU, market surveillance authorities really need to act without delay to remove the banned products that they find. And at the border, customs authorities identify the goods, suspend and refuse and seize and dispose. So review and appeal routes exist as well. So you can seek review on any new substantial information that has not been before the authority during the investigation. Or you can seek withdrawal once the forced labor has been eliminated. So the key takeaway here is that everything really hinges on what you can evidence within 30 to 60 working days. This is traceability and documentation that you should have kind of prepared before December 2027. But we will go into this point a bit later on. Anina will take us through the preparation phase. All right, then if we look still at the next phase of the process a bit more in detail, so what actually happens when a ban is placed on products. First of all, we have the decision, as mentioned, so the ban applies to the product and not the company. So every company selling that product is affected, even those that have never been investigated. companies get at least 30 working days to comply, or 10 for perishable goods. And the decision, as mentioned, is lifted once it is shown that the forced labor has been removed or gotten rid of in the supply chain. Then there's the withdrawal. So all affected stock has to be traced, including goods held for online sales. So a withdrawal plan and progress reports need to be provided to the authority. And products already sold to consumers do not have to be recalled, as mentioned before. Then there's the disposal. So withdrawn products need to be recycled and rendered unusable if recycling is not possible. Perishable goods go to charity or another public cause. And if only one component is banned, it can be replaced and the product sold again. Then finally, we have the penalties. So the penalty is actually for ignoring the decision, not for the forced labor itself. And the size depends on how serious the breach was and how long it lasted. Customs hold the goods at the border and can refuse, seize, and destroy them. And the penalties will be set by the EU member states for each member state. Then finally, if we look a little bit more into the regulation and what information are we still waiting on? On the left here, we have the things that we genuinely do not know yet. So the enforcement is national, so capacity and appetite will differ from one member state to the next. The penalties are national too, so the member states must notify their rules on fines by 14th of December this year. There's also kind of no precedent yet, so we don't know actually in detail how much evidence satisfies the authority at this stage or what remediation will be expected before a banned product can return to the market. And then there are some resources that we are still also waiting on from the EU. So the first one here is the EU Forced Labor Risk Database that we mentioned. It will be publicly available and an indicative and non-exhaustive map of widespread and severe forced labor risks linked to specific geographical areas and products. And it will draw on sources such as the ILO, the UN, and academic institutions. For most companies, and especially smaller ones, this is meant to be the starting point for scoping where your risks sit. There is no public version available yet, and we are waiting to hear when that will be published. Then second, there's the forced labor single portal and the single information submission point. The portal is the central public site, which will host the database and the guidelines and the list of national competent authorities and every published ban decision. If a product is banned, that is where it becomes public. And then the submission point sits inside that portal, and anyone can use the information point to submit information about a suspected violation, and that includes workers, trade unions, and civil society organizations, for example. And this is how a lot of the investigations will likely start in practice. Both the portal and the submission point should open on the 14th of December 2027 at the latest. Then thirdly, we have the national competent authorities and single points of contact. So we're still waiting for information on who will actually investigate within each member state. And several of the member states have not confirmed this information yet. But I think the important thing to notice here is not to wait. What will be tested really in practice will be the traceability and the due diligence processes that are in place. And those are something that all companies should start to build now. And then more information will come later on still. All right, I think I will hand over to Anina next.
All right, thank you so much, Sara, and thanks everyone who's already posting Q&A questions. We see them all. There's a lot coming in. There's over 100 participants now on the call, and many of you are active with Q&As, so that's wonderful. We're going to try and answer as many as we can, but of course, as always, we will also come back to you who have participated and asked questions, and we can keep the dialogue going also after the webinar. I'm going to cover in this next section, how should companies start preparing? And I could see that there was a question that just popped in, if how companies should start preparing. Is a code of conduct sufficient? Was the question that popped in here just before my section here started. And the short answer is no, a code of conduct is not sufficient. It does help you along the way, but that alone won't get you to where you need to be in terms of this piece of regulation. But let me speak a little bit more to how companies should start preparing. Now, do keep in mind that, of course, this is a new piece of regulation. I don't think anyone has the full answers in terms of what's going to be enough. In some cases, there's just going to have to be, some legal precedents being built up before companies truly know what good looks like. But of course, from the guidance and from the regulatory text itself, we can draw some indication on what companies should start doing now. So let's go into the material in this next section. First of all, there's really two key things that companies should start thinking about when it comes to preparation for this regulation. First of all, it's about strengthening your due diligence. And I know Sara just covered in her section saying that the law itself doesn't really mandate you to do due diligence, but when you look at the guidance and you think of what means do you have at your disposal, then of course due diligence is an absolute key measure that any company can and should strengthen. And of course it goes nicely hand in hand for those of you who are already also in scope of other due diligence regulation or will be in scope of the CSDDD. And the second thing that's important is to improve the traceability. A lot of companies today have fairly limited value chain traceability. They might have good traceability in tier 1, but usually anything beyond tier 1 starts to be a bit of a different story. So one of the first key things is really to start mapping your supply chain and getting a better idea of what does that look like beyond tier 1 and where could you have some risks, and then start building due diligence around that. Let me go a little bit deeper into what that means. Many of you are probably very familiar with the due diligence wheel that's been introduced by the OECD, and many companies have already voluntarily signed up to doing due diligence way before this was regulatory requirements. But of course, now we have many pieces of regulation, especially in the EU, but not just in the EU, in other parts of the world as well, where due diligence is rising. Some of the questions we also got here in the Q&A was whether we will cover more about the Chinese due diligence or American due diligence regulation and how these all interact. We're not going to be able to go deeper into that today, but we are going to write about this very soon. I think what's key to understand is that when we look at these different pieces of due diligence regulation, and here I'm going to broadly also consider for a while the forced labor regulation as part of this, although it's technically a market access regulation, it does build on these 6 OECD steps. So if you as a company are already working very targetedly on due diligence, then you have already started your preparations. However, we do know from working with many clients on this that even if you are starting working with due diligence, the depth of it and the quality of your documentation and the consistency often varies quite a lot. But the first things that, of course, you should consider doing is embedding this into your policies and codes of conduct. Here's where the code of conduct also comes into play. And then you really need to start working on identifying and assessing the impacts that you have in your value chain and in your operations. You need to start looking into how could you seize, prevent, or mitigate adverse impacts that you have, track and implement, communicate, etc. We've written a lot about these different pieces and the steps in depth also in relation to CSDDD, so I'm not going to go that deep to these different pieces today, but let's more focus on what this means now in relation to the EU forced labor regulation. Next slide, please. So, 5 very concrete things you as a company should start preparing for now as the EU forced labor regulation is coming your way. As I already mentioned, start by mapping your supply chain. Start looking at what does it actually look like, where do you have some high risk regions and sectors, and how does that tie to your actual product. And the more you can look at this from a risk-based perspective, the stronger you also stand in terms of being able to look at where are you most likely exposed. When it comes to the second step, upgrading your due diligence to actually be very targeted about forced labor, you should of course make sure to look at how are you screening your suppliers and their facilities today. What contractual requirements are you putting on not just your tier one, but through your tier one beyond them? How do you actually audit for potential infringements? What monitoring mechanisms do you have in place? And have you already built some remediation processes? Now, these steps are things you would recognize from any regulation that pushes for more due diligence. And of course, once you're also potentially in parallel preparing for the CSDDD, these are good steps to take for any due diligence topics. But specifically when it comes to the forced labor side, of course, this regulation triggers you to pay extra attention to those topics. Now, the third step is really where I think we're starting to see some new elements that are going to require companies to step up their documentation game. In order for you to be able to answer these potential inquiries you might face from different authorities, you need to have investigation-ready documentation. As Sara already covered, the timelines for answering potential requests is fairly tight. So you do need to start building these files or dossiers on what would you present if you get these requests, and make sure that you have fairly quick ways of responding to this in your organization. This, for example, can be more details about your product and inventory, how that is traced through the chain, supplier lists and production sites, not just for tier one, but beyond, and any documentation you have of how you've made sure that there's not any forced labor issues across this chain. A very practical step, and that's step number 4 here, is of course to make sure that your current contracts are up to date with these requirements. Now, typically, of course, your contracts only face your tier 1, but already there you can start strengthening your expectations towards your tier 1 suppliers, as these are, of course, your main partners in some ways in making sure that the rest of the chain has the requirements that you set forward on this in place as well. Fifth step, of course, please also do coordinate with other EU developments, and I would even expand that to other global developments because there's a lot happening in this field. There's no point in building parallel structures for forced labor when you are also potentially in scope for other due diligence requirements. So do make sure that you align this work with the different things you need to be doing, for example, for the CSDDD, if you're in scope for that, or if you're in scope for other similar types of regulations that we've covered. Let's continue here with the example we've put together. So quite often we face the question, well, most of my issues are most likely in tier 3 or beyond. Like, how should I as a company start even approaching this? And this is, of course, one of the absolute trickiest parts of this, that typically companies have control over their own operations and a large control also over the suppliers they use, but anything beyond that starts to become more muddled. This is now our thinking in terms of how we would recommend you approach this. So not as such exactly how the regulation says you should do it, but we wanted to bring a practical example here into this webinar as well. So let's say that you've now done your risk mapping and you have identified that you probably have some potential risks in your tier 3 in this practical example. So once you have identified that you probably have a risk or an issue, mind you, you might not know for sure yet, then of course you should start looking more in depth into this. Here you can, for example, use the EU risk database to do a little bit more digging, or other credible sources to make sure that you get a deeper understanding of exactly how you're probably exposed. Different sectoral risk assessments are usually quite useful tools for this. Now, once you know more about where this risk most likely lies, potentially in terms of, the actual region or the part of your business that at least you've identified as being most exposed, then you should start working through your tier 1 suppliers to actually start mapping this chain out and get to the points where you have your biggest concerns. And there, of course, the goal should be to establish whether the risk is real or is this something that actually is mitigated or not a non-issue for you currently. Here, building those traceability maps is a very important action. This is also something you can then show to the authorities and say, well, we've actually identified this as our high-risk areas. We've started working towards these issues. We worked through our tier 1 suppliers. We've mapped tier 2 and tier 3, and we're in the process of getting this documentation. Now, of course, nobody fully knows today what will be a sufficient level of documentation to show the authorities here. But I think it's safe to say that if you can start showing that you have done your homework and building this traceability, that will probably work in your favor, even if you wouldn't have all of the answers just yet. And the more, of course, you can start showing that you're also preventing and mitigating these issues through your code of conducts that are cascaded through your tier 1 into deeper tiers, and that you actually monitor and follow this up systematically, the stronger you will stand. And finally, the documentation and monitoring, this does require that you build up some muscles that you might not have today in place in terms of both having that traceability and that ongoing monitoring. Because, of course, it's not enough that you just do this once. You need to actually be able to track this in a credible way. Here's where, for example, some industry associations are probably helpful in terms of building that joint visibility if you share a lot of the value chains with peers in your industry. Or if you have very unique value chains, then you do need to find ways to build this visibility yourself or in collaboration with some good partners. But you should remember that as with any due diligence exercise, it is on a rolling, ongoing basis that you have to do this work. So because of that, it's just not enough to do it once, but to actually embed it in the way you work with these topics today. So, in order for you to be ready by December 2027, there are some first steps that we would recommend that you take. First of all, it's good to start by building this overall understanding of where do you stand today in general when it comes to your due diligence processes, because this will be one of the most helpful tools and leverage points you have to actually start embedding this. We would then recommend to look more closely into the gaps you have in your current governance. It's most likely issues with, for example, who owns the overall implementation of this and the monitoring and building this traceability that you need, and thereby also then figuring out what needs to be your first action. And of course, we don't have a lot of time here ahead of December 2027, so you also need to choose how do you make the right actions now in terms of the short-term roadmap that you need to create. As Sara also mentioned, of course, it's still unclear how quickly then the regulation will be actually enforced. One thing is that it starts the implementation or enforcement in December 2027, but how quickly will national authorities or the Commission actually start investigating into these issues? That's still open. Nevertheless, if you want to make sure that you're prepared, you should, of course, work quite diligently now in the next 12 plus months towards this deadline. A bit more concretely, here on the next slide, how we're helping some of our clients today. We've created this simple maturity scoring methodology where we, together with our clients, walk them through some of these requirements more in detail and score their current maturity today. This can then become your kind of maturity mapping that you use to build your roadmap, where you get a sense of where do you have your biggest issues in terms of are you close to actually having closed this gap, or are you still very far and actually need to prioritize this? And typically what we would look at is governance and policies. What do you have today in place that actually helps you with this? Have you done any risk assessments that show that you understand your issues? What are you then doing with those risks? What type of traceability do you have today, and where do you still need to build that? What type of supplier engagement do you do today, and does it go beyond tier 1 in any way? What due diligence measures in terms of seizing, preventing, or mitigating issues do you have today? Those muscles could be applied also for these topics. And of course, as I already mentioned, the response readiness and the documentation readiness. How quickly and easily would you be able to pull this type of documentation today? And what would it take to actually get there? Now, if you're interested in learning more about how we do this, please reach out to me or Sara, and we're happy to set up a meeting and do this assessment for you. It doesn't take a long time. We typically run it for over 1 to 2 hours, and then from there you get kind of an initial screening of where you stand. All right, that was a lot of content in 45 minutes. Now we have roughly 15 minutes for the Q&A session, and I can see the questions have kept rolling in. So let's take a quick look at where we stand with the Q&As. All right, Sara, are you ready to tackle the Q&A side of the webinar?
Yes, I can try.
All right. So let's take a look at some of the questions that have come in. First of all, there was a question about, is there a specific value for the fine to be imposed alongside the ban? I think this is a callback to some of the slides you had initially in the webinar, Sara.
Yes, so the fine will be specifically for not removing a product that has been banned. So if a violation has been determined, then the company should remove those products that are affected. And if this is not done, then there would be a fine. And the fine will be determined by each member state. And that has not, to my knowledge, been done yet. So it is yet to be determined. I believe the deadline for it was the December of this year for the member states to define those.
All right, thank you, Sara. Another question here from the chat. Could you elaborate on what it means that the products themselves are banned, irrespective of company?
Yes, so this is a product level regulation. So, for example, if the authority determines that a certain product has been produced or made with forced labor in the supply chain, then it will be that product that's removed. So even if different companies are selling that product, there are different distributors or importers and so on, kind of indicated or implicated, then it will apply to them rather than the whole company. So if it is only one product of several products that the company sells, it is only that specific product that is banned.
Okay, so that is, of course, a pretty good distinction to keep in mind as we're working our way here through the questions. Let me take a look at one of the other questions that came on a little bit earlier here in the webinar. Okay, Sara, so here was a request to repeat the bit about whether products made available on the market before the 14th of December 27 will be within or outside the scope of this regulation. So maybe you, Sara, can elaborate also a little bit on that.
Yes, so if they are still being sold or made available when the regulation is in force, so after December 27, then they are in scope. But if it is something that has already been sold to a consumer, for example, or is no longer being sold, then it is not in scope, if that makes sense. But if for example, the product has already been imported to the EU before that date, but then it is still being sold after that date, it is still in scope. I hope that helps clarify.
Cool. Let's take a look a little bit at some of the questions that have come in here later on. And for the participants, of course, we are going to try and cover as many of the questions as possible, but I can already see from the list that we are probably not going to be able to cover everything here today. So I'm going to try and pick some of the ones that I think are most useful and helpful for all of the participants here today. And then we are happy to continue the dialogue with all of you individually as well if you're interested. Here's a question, Sara. Do you know when we can expect the EU risk database to be published?
That's a good question. As far as I can see, it was already supposed to be published, but it is not yet available. It only says under development. So I'm afraid I don't have that information yet.
So that's something we're all waiting to get more knowledge on. A little bit related in terms of to the EU resources, there's a question here. Is there a risk that the portal can have false claims raised on companies? I think this is an interesting question, right? Because I guess the simple answer is potentially. but then of course it should be up to the authorities to actually make some initial assessments on whether they should pursue this. But perhaps, Sara, you have some other inputs here as well.
Yes, so as far as I understand, the portal will not have so there's a difference between the portal and then the single kind of information submission point. The submission point is the portal where, or the kind of register where anyone can go and register these suspected violations and so on, and those will then be investigated. You can report something anonymously, or with your information on it, and then of course, if your information on it is on it, you will be kind of contacted for further information, for the authorities to be able to investigate that claim. The portal, from what I know, it won't have every single kind of report on it. It will rather have a list of those products that have been banned. So I don't think all kind of reports will be public in that sense. But yes, of course, there is a risk of there being wrong information if a kind of wrong report has been made and so on. But of course, that will then be investigated by the authorities, and then they decide if a kind of deeper official investigation will take place.
And I think here's also, of course, interesting that there's this potential also discrepancy that potentially could happen across the EU, where different national authorities also could choose different ways of approaching this. All right. I'm gonna take a question here posted around the products and the destruction of products. The question stands here as, I am curious about the following measures in a case a product is being investigated and let's say ended up being destroyed. Wouldn't the authorities investigate other products or items from the same company?
Yes, I would say it is likely. And as part of their kind of probably the preliminary assessment, they will determine whether it is just that product that is being investigated, or is it the entire site perhaps, or a product line and so on. So I think it will be likely that other kind of products within that whatever has been suspected, or wherever the suspected violation has taken place will be looked at, whether it's a specific site, a specific supplier, a specific kind of product line, and so on.
And of course, here we're a little bit now speculating and interpreting what we think likely will happen. But of course, this is also something where we need to see how the enforcement actually starts rolling in terms of what this looks like. A little bit similarly, but also an interesting question, because this tackles not the ones that are putting the products on the market, but the companies that procure large volumes of goods. The question is, what are the main indirect impacts of the EU forced labor ban? So if you're not as such placing the products on the market, but you're procuring them in large goods or large quantities, or making significant investments, what could kind of indirectly hit your business? And a reflection I had reading this question was, then of course there's also the measures where if you're dependent on large quantities of a certain type of product, and then suddenly you're out of that material, or you're out of whatever it is you're trying to procure, then that can become a massive risk to your own business. It depends a little bit, of course, on what we're talking about here. But if somebody in your value chain is exposed in terms of this regulation, and that component or that material is not allowed to enter the EU, that will potentially have big ripple effects. Anything you would like to elaborate here on, Sara?
No, I fully agree. It is, of course, due diligence in that sense also is important for building the company's resilience. So if it's something that you are procuring, to make sure that it meets these requirements.
Great. So we have around 5 minutes to go here. If there's a question you want to ask that you have not yet posted, please go ahead and do so. I'm going to pick out, as I said, as many as I can from the Q&A section here. An interesting question here from Melissa. Are certification schemes and a few examples, FSC, RSPO, Fairtrade, etc., taken into account during the investigation process? And I think before Sara, you elaborate here in terms of what you see in the guidance, I think it's also fair to say that nobody fully knows what will be taken into account in the investigation process and what will count to your benefit. I think what we can always say here is if you can credibly show that you've tried to map your risks, gone for building this traceability, gone for building your due diligence, and can show that in different ways, then this will benefit you. Any of these specific ones, Sara, that you've come across in the guidance as you read through it?
Yes, so the guidance does list possible documents that will be asked from the companies that are investigated, and these do include kind of product traceability data and kind of documentation linking the finished product with raw materials. And in that sense, I think certifications will definitely help here. They're not mentioned kind of exactly, or any specific certifications have not been mentioned, but of course, if it helps provide this link to the raw material and shows responsible practice there, then I believe it will be helpful.
And a little bit in the same lane is a question on what are the minimum requirements around traceability. And this is, of course, a tricky question because neither the regulation or the guidance says anything about minimum requirements as such. It is about credibly showing that you built this traceability and trying to do this as diligently as possible. But perhaps you can, Sara, still elaborate a little bit on what do you see the guidance pointing to when it comes to building that traceability?
Yes, I think key things are, of course, any documentation for the products itself, so product IDs and so on that help the authorities identify the products. Then there is, of course, bills of materials and other sort of traceability documents, documentation of the different suppliers within the product supply chain and so on. But as you said, there's no kind of defined minimum requirements. I think we'll have to wait and see a little bit as to what this will look like in practice, and we'll have to wait and see also if this will differ significantly between member states and how they approach this. But I think a good starting point is anything showing the materials used and so on, and the suppliers used in your product supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Then a question that came in here towards the latter part of the webinar, following up on the ban of products versus companies. I see how this matters for a company selling different products, but will another company that sells the same type of product that has been banned also be affected? I think interesting wording here, same type of product, because I think that could potentially influence the answer here, but I'll let you, Sara, reply.
Yes, so as I think we mentioned that the authorities will kind of look into or prioritize what they are investigating based on the different risks and kind of indicators of forced labor. So if, for example, the risk database says that certain types of products or kind of geographies are at risk, then if there are similar types of other products available, of course, those will be probably prioritized. There's no kind of automatic that if a same type of product is banned that another one will be banned automatically. There is still going to be an investigation there. If it's from the same supplier, or if there's certain components or so on from the same supplier where this type of violation has perhaps been identified, then of course that will be investigated and prioritized, I would assume.
Thank you, Sara. We are almost at the end here of the webinar, but let's see if we could still cover a few questions before we round off for today. Okay, so here's a question around a coffee supplier. If forced labor is identified at a coffee supplier, a good example, but the importer cannot trace which finished products contain that supplier's coffee, would the consequences apply only to the known affected products or potentially to the entire product portfolio lacking traceability?
That's a good question. I have to say I'm not sure. I think there is a key point here that the authorities have the kind of responsibility to demonstrate that forced labor has occurred. So my suspicion would be that if they cannot sufficiently kind of evidence that there has been forced labor within this product supply chain, that would be very difficult for them to then make a decision on or enforce a ban on. But I'm not 100% sure on this one, I'm afraid.
Well, I think it speaks to the complexities of the matter. And I think one of the final things I want to call out here is also several of the questions, of course, have to do with complex multiple global supply chains. And that is really the tricky part here. How do you build that visibility and traceability? And I think that's a big task any company now faces to make sure that they build those mechanics because it's not an easy task. There are some tools that are starting to be helpful in this space and happy to elaborate more on that. But for now, I think we're at the point where we are also rounding this webinar up here for today. I'm sure we could keep the conversation going. The questions we did not get to, we will write to all of you who we can see have posted questions that we were not able to reply to today and see if we can tackle them one-to-one. If not, I want to thank you all for participating in this webinar. It's always a pleasure. We are going to keep monitoring this topic and write more about both the EU forced labor regulation and other regulatory developments that influence this field and companies as well. So please make sure to follow along as we post more content on this topic. For now, thank you so much for participating today and have a lovely day wherever in the world you may be. Thank you so much. And thank you, Sara.